My name is Gabe Rhodes, and I'm an account executive here at Wherefore. Wherefore is an ERP focusing on the cannabis industry, and we operate in every legal state across the United States and Canada. Today, we're lucky to have David and Rachel from Michael and Macomber on the line, and they're going to chat with you a little bit more on what to expect throughout your transition from BioTrack to Metrc. So, without further ado, I will let David take it from here.
Cool. Thanks, Gabe. Yeah, we're really excited to be able to reach out and provide help to the teammates in Illinois as they're going through this transition. We've participated in these kinds of change initiatives for quite some time. We've implemented intact different technical solutions that integrate with Metrc in virtually every state that Metrc is operating. We've worked with a lot of other regulatory systems, including BioTrack, and we spend a ton of time with every single department that works in cannabis and with these ERPs, with inventory modules and regulatory systems. So we're really eager to be able to provide support. We're doing these AMAs as a way of fielding some of the bigger questions that are coming out and addressing pain points week by week as they come up and as we're asked for support. We felt like this was a pretty efficient way of taking care of that. Last week's agenda touched on the items that you see here on the screen. And so today what we're going to be doing is taking a look at how the use of Metrc is going to express itself in our real world. You may have worked with a number of different systems where what you see on the interface isn't necessarily what you're going to expect to do in your physical world. In Metrc, you're going to have things like adjustments, you're going to have things like transfers, but in your real world, you're thinking about, hey, I have a product that needs to waste out. I need to have a product that disappeared off the shelf. Hey, I found that product. I'm needing to move this product over to somebody to do testing, but they're never going to send it back, but it's not a sale. How do these all express themselves in the real world? So we're going to walk through those. Additionally, the different systems that you can use that integrate with Metrc present you with different opportunities of how you can define your stages that you report back to Metrc, how you can navigate certain challenges with Metrc when it goes offline, things like this. So we're going to work through those. I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. She's going to walk us through some of these questions. So, Rach, if you're looking at Metrc and you're trying to relate the Metrc terms to your real world actions, what are some of those that are going to be potentially not exactly what you would think in terms of what's on the label of that button?
Yeah. So that's actually a really interesting question, because one of the very first things that we run into in terms of companies that are using Metrc or required to use Metrc is this exact issue. Inside of Metrc, there is a stripped down number of transactions that are available. So there are transfers, there are adjustments, there are package splits, things like this. And what do those mean in the real world? What might those have meant in BioTrack, et cetera? So let's just talk about it really between the real world and Metrc. We are getting to the point where most companies are either already actively working in Metrc or will be required to be actively working in Metrc within the next 3 days to 3 weeks, depending on if you are cultivation, infusing, or a dispensary. Adjustments, for example, inside of Metrc, an adjustment is going to be used for things like moisture loss. It's going to be used for things like theft, destruction of product that has any of those types of issues. One of the things that in the past you may have thought of as an adjustment, or that your finance team might think of as an adjustment, or that your supply chain team might think of as an adjustment, but isn't an adjustment inside of Metrc, would be sending product to a lab. If you send product to a lab, that product is never going to come back. You need to get that product off of your inventory, which you can do so in Metrc, but you also need to get that product off your books and out of your supply chain planning, because it is not product that you can use again in the future. In most systems, this would be an adjustment of some kind, an adjustment to lab or destruction or something along that lines, how most people might think of this. However, because of the way that Metrc looks at the entire state of Illinois as one big group and the licenses as individual locations, this would actually be a transfer. You have to create a transfer, and you have to actually create a separate tag to transfer that product over to the lab, even though that product will never come back. And so that's a situation in which you'll use a transfer. A lot of times people think, oh, well, transfers inside of Metrc are always going to be purchases, transfer in, or they are going to be sales, a transfer out. However, that's not really the case. In terms of what your finance team or even your supply chain team might be needing to look at it. For example, a transfer to a lab is definitely not going to be a sale. It would probably be something more along the lines of an adjustment. But then also a transfer to a toll processor. If you have your product being sent out to another company to roll pre-rolls for you, or to trim for you, or to extract for you, because it's something that you don't do in-house. From a financial perspective, that product still belongs to you. From a supply chain planning perspective, supply chain needs to be able to plan to have that product available in its next stage and in its next form at some point in the not too distant future. And so again, this is a situation in which a transfer is definitely not a sale, nor is it a purchase when it comes back from that toll processor. It really is going to be just that, a transfer of product between two locations. And so there starts to be this conversation of when should your team decide to use what kind of transaction? Even underneath these individual transactions, there's going to be additional pieces of information. A really good example of this is when you do a transfer. There are several different transfer types. There is QA on-site testing as a transfer type. There's a state authorized transfer, which a lot of times is being used when you're sending product to a lab. There is a transfer, which is used to transfer between two licenses that might be commonly owned by the same company. And then there's a wholesale manifest. The wholesale manifest is really the one that you kind of consider to be a sale to an external customer. However, it would also be something that you would use when you are transferring the product to a toll processor, a license that's not commonly owned. In other words, you don't own that license. And so again, when do you use a wholesale manifest transfer versus a state authorized transfer versus a regular transfer? These are all the types of decisions that your team is going to need to be able to make inside of Metrc, and to change your SOPs to allow you to have your team decide which one they should use, and to be able to use it consistently, correctly, the same way. This is going to be really important, not only in terms of making sure that Metrc stays clean enough for you to use it, but also in terms of what happens the day after you get through the regulatory change. Because we all know that the moment you get through that regulatory change, then you have finance and supply chain coming and knocking at your door and saying to you, hey, you know, I've got to do my monthly close. Hey, I need to be able to update my purchasing lists, etc. And they will need to also be able to use this data as well. So it's not just that it is regulatory compliant, it's also that it can be used for your entire team and your entire company. When we're talking about some of the other areas that are going to be impacted once you get through the sheer regulatory change, let's use some real world examples of where this might impact other places and other teams. So inside of the cultivation world, when you are drying product, you have moisture loss. Now, moisture loss is going to be really important for several reasons, both the supply chain as well as to the team, the costing team. Inside of the drop-down list, and please do remember that your adjustments are going to have a predefined drop-down list. Your adjustments aren't going to let you just use any old choice that you would like for your adjustments. Metrc has a very, very specific list of adjustments that it will allow you to use in terms of reasons, and no more. So I can give a quick example of that. API adjustment error, drying, entry error, plants unpacked, scale variance, spoilage, theft, and waste. That is your drop down from Metrc. So again, when you go back to talking about that, creating that glossary of terms, you'll need to tell your team, when X happens in the real world, you should use Y adjustment reason in Metrc. This will allow for not only consistency of use that supports reporting, what little reporting you can get out of Metrc, but also to make sure that if you have a compliance audit, it's very, very clear to your auditor that you are using the system consistently the same way, and that you don't end up with a red flag for something that says scale variance when it should be spoilage or something to that effect. Waste adjustments are really important, especially in the plant world. And so again, all of those kinds of things are going to be super important to make sure you've got real clarity. So going back to those real world examples of how this is going to impact all of your other departments, when you're going from a wet plant that you have just harvested to the point when the plant is dry and ready to be bucked or ready to be trimmed, at that point in time, you're going to lose approximately 70% of the weight of that product through moisture loss. Now, in terms of supply chain, they can probably use some assumptions to allow them to understand what that change was. But when it comes down to the costing team, there's really a need to be able to consolidate all of the cost of that wet plant into just the quantity of dry plant. You don't want to adjust out with that quantity, you don't want to adjust out value. This is something where Wherefore can really help in this situation. Wherefore allows you to define what portion of that part of that transition of that product from harvested wet plant to dried plant should be retaining the cost, and what part should be recorded inside of Metrc as a moisture loss. Again, really super important, because back to those adjustments, you don't want to adjust it out for anything. You want it to be a moisture loss adjustment. Other systems may or may not have the ability to define what the change, that big of a change in quantity is the result of, but Wherefore it does. When you have that big of a quantity change at that point in the process, you can define it as moisture loss as opposed to just a shrinkage of the product. If you are inside of manufacturing, there is a lot of lab testing that happens in manufacturing even before you get to that final lab testing. So the ability to efficiently break off tags and get those tags sent out to a lab and still retain the rest of the value of the product as a whole inside of whatever is remaining on the tag after that lab testing, that is also a really important ability to be able to do that. While you can define the quantity being sent to the lab inside of Metrc, we have to remember that Metrc does not have any costing capabilities for the manufacturing or the cultivation process. It has some costing possibilities around just the transfer of finished goods, because at that point, the cost of the product is fairly stable. That's the cost of your product, whatever it's being sold for, whatever you're bringing it in at, et cetera, that you've got your cost there. But when you're talking about cultivation or manufacturing, where you're taking multiple things to create a new thing, including sometimes non-cannabis products, those costs are not going to be tracked in Metrc appropriately and will not provide any costing support for your finance team. Metrc will not provide any tracking of non-cannabis inventory. So where BioTrack would allow you to connect to BioTrack compliance, and also then be able to use the expanded portions of BioTrack to potentially track non-cannabis products, inside of Metrc, you don't have that possibility. You have to connect to a third party to be able to track anything that is non-cannabis. Again, I'm bringing this up because while right now you're in the middle of this transition directly into the compliance side of it, and we've got 3 days for cultivation and manufacturing. The 25th, I believe, is when you're supposed to start having those transactions happen there. That means that you might be able to get to the point where you can at least transact in Metrc, but you may lose some functionality that you need to be able to gain back. And if that's the case, that's definitely somewhere that Wherefore can give some real support in allowing you to recoup some of that functionality that you might have been depending on in the past. If you're looking at just the transaction right now of getting into Metrc and you've got 3 days left, it is very much triage stage. And in that situation, you would want you to reach out to us right away to make sure that we could help you with that triage. If you're inside of wholesale, there's a really big part of this that is going to be what products are going to be available, what stage are they at, what products are coming down the line. This comes in around what are the stages of your product and what visibility can you give people. The roles and permissions inside of Metrc are not very robust, and so you may have limited visibility. Most of the people that we find using Metrc depend on a fairly extensive set of external menus to be able to provide their wholesale team with a list of products that are going to be available soon, because they can't have their wholesale sales team having access to, all of the products that are coming down the line. That's something that you would need a third-party product like Wherefore to be able to do, to be able to give access for your teams to see what is coming, what is in process, versus only seeing what is already available in the system. Additionally, inside of Metrc with that lockdown, you may have to give more access than you're really comfortable with to allow people to see what's in quarantine, etc. And again, that's something where a system like Wherefore can provide some flexibility while still keeping guardrails to keep people from making changes to things they shouldn't have access to make change to. If you are in the retail world, this kind of the differences between the way that Metrc refers to things and the way that that BioTrack referred to things, or the way that you refer things in the real world, is going to be very, very impactful. When we're talking about cultivation and infusers or manufacturers or even lab licenses, they can work directly in Metrc and do pretty much all of their actions in Metrc, even though they won't have the robust functionality and they won't have the robust reporting. What is the case for retail, though, is you will have to use a third-party POS service. Metrc is not a POS service whatsoever. There is no POS functionality inside of Metrc. And so in that situation, you're really looking at, do you have a POS system? Does your POS system connect automatically to Metrc? If it doesn't, you will have to be able to come up with a solution by which you can extract your sales for the day out of your POS system and manually get them into Metrc, either through an import or just through hand jamming, which I really would not suggest. And then additionally, if you are having one that's connected, how much information inside of your POS system do you need to revise in order to be able to use it with Metrc's connection? For example, if the field that you were using before for the BioTrack tag now needs to have a Metrc tag, how do you make those changes in your POS system to make sure that those two fields can connect? And in order to be able to demonstrate to an auditor that you do have recall capabilities, how are you able to make a connection between a BioTrack tag and a Metrc tag today? So for example, in retail, the goal is that you'll sell through as much of your product as you can before that June 17th cutoff date, at which point you're supposed to be transacting primarily inside of Metrc. But there will be some product, especially for stores that tend to buy several weeks in advance. There will be product that came from your cultivator or came from your infuser with a BioTrack tag. I believe it is starting in about a week and a half on June 3rd that all of the transfers that come into your store will come in through Metrc, and so therefore they will have a Metrc tag. But the product that you receive between now and then may have a BioTrack tag on it, and so you would have to retag that product. So if you are retagging in the retail store, you're going to want to reference what the BioTrack tag was that you got when that product came in originally, so that if there was a recall, or if you need to be able to demonstrate recall capabilities, you could show how to be able to figure out what license it came from, and to be able to then have that licensee be able to know what other products might need to be recalled. So again, there's a lot in here that has to do with how you structure this information. Going back again to real world examples of how the terms might be different, a return inside if you're retail, you're returning the product to a vendor. If you are returning at the time when it arrives, it's called a rejection, and that is done automatically, or not automatically, that is done directly on the transfer. So when you do the transfer and you're accepting that transfer, and you would reject that line on the transfer. However, if you have to return product after the fact, let's say that you just can't sell it and you want to send it back to your retailer. We know that doesn't happen a ton inside of cannabis, but we have seen times when it did happen. that is actually going to be a transfer. So you would have to go and create a transfer inside of Metrc. So going back again to the idea that not all transfers are going to be AP, not all transfers are going to be AR. There's a variety of real world use cases that might come back to being called a transfer inside of Metrc. So again, wanting to make sure that we define this.
Rich, let me interject a real question that's come up. So it's kind of two parts. It's why are those adjustment types locked down the way they are? And in the situation where the user isn't really clear on how, or it's not obvious, how is this relating to this physical action that I'm supposed to do? How would they get guidance in what is the right adjustment type to use?
Right. So let's start with the reason why there's a lockdown list. There is a desire to standardize for the for compliance what kind of adjustments there are. There's a need for compliance officers who are doing audits, as well as just the state in general, to be able to be very clear as to what the adjustment reasons are. There was probably a lockdown list inside of BioTrack as well, but you weren't doing your adjustments inside of BioTrack. You were actually filling out paperwork and sending that into the state, and the state was recording the adjustment inside of BioTrack. So that's a pro to move to Metrc, is you don't have to wait for 24, 48 hours at best case scenario to have your adjustment show up. But at the same time, it does mean that now your team needs to be able to decide what the reason code should be based on what's happening in the real world. There's no more sending it to the state with an explanation than having the state be able to properly assign it. What we suggest is that you get together, that anyone who is making this transition, put together a list of real world things that happen for your team that you would think of as a reason for an adjustment. Things like I broke a vial on the ground. Things like we got mildew on a some plant, on some plant material. A variety of those kinds of things. It got lighter. It continued to dry while it was on the shelf, and it got lighter. That kind of thing. And put together those lists, and then sit down with your compliance team and say, what do you recommend we use as an adjustment? You might sit down with your team ahead of time and say, we think that this reason from the drop down menu is the reason that we would use, but I would always run by your compliance officer, simply because they may believe from a regulatory perspective, or their reading of the regulations, that you should use a different reason code. So we always recommend that people run it by their compliance officer, but I do think it is a really good idea to put together a matrix of these kinds of things, and then also to provide very clear instruction to your team that should there be any question, check with whoever the director or manager of that department is, to make sure that the correct reason code is being chosen.
Yeah. So then that brings up something else that you mentioned earlier, which I think would be worth going into. You said, as a guide, as you're going through understanding that, this transfer to a lab, well, that's going to be handled differently than some of the other transfers that we're using.
Yeah.
Can you explain a little bit more about SOP development, and how is it different than the work instructions that we already have developed around many of processes in other systems?
So work instructions, I'll start by defining work instructions, because I think that's a really good way of starting, because work instructions are used in SOPs, but SOPs include work instructions, but work instructions are kind of the smaller subset inside of an SOP. So let's start with work instructions. Work instructions are what you are provided by the software, individual softwares, a lot of times. So a set of work instructions would be things like, to create a new tag, click the plus button up at the top right-hand corner under whatever label is there. From the drop-down list, choose the correct tag, or scan your tag in, or whatever the actual action is. So it's a step-by-step of what button to push, what information to enter in that field, drop-down menu versus self-defined kind of a thing. And then, how to get all the way through from one to end of that specific action, like creating a tag, or splitting a package, or creating an adjustment. So for example, in a work instruction for creating an adjustment, it would say, search for the tag, find the tag, click adjust out, put in the quantity being adjusted, select reason code from the drop down. That would be a set of work instructions. An SOP gives more information than that. So an SOP should give the why behind what you're doing. So for example, an SOP would include things like what's happening in the physical space. So an SOP would be when trimming flower, obtain the physical flower, you know, that the physical plant that you're about to trim, weigh it, find the tag in Metrc, you know, add the new tag, trim the flower, put the weight of the trimmed flower on the new tag, you know, adjust the rest off for moisture with the reason code moisture loss. And that SOP, as you can see, is integrating with the work instructions. It does say adjust off, and it might make a connection to how to do an adjustment, but it gives you the reason code. Adjust off the remaining weight using reason code moisture loss. And so that SOP is your standard operating practice. It includes what's going on in the real world. It includes why you are doing what you are doing. So the decision making behind, you know, what action you're going to take, what that action is going to be that reflects that real world activity, where you're going to do it. So when you're going to be using a scale, when you're going to be using Metrc, when you might put the information into a third-party app. So for example, in retail, you know, put the information into the third-party POS system and expect it to flow over to Metrc. That's a very common thing is, when do I, you know, use Metrc? When do I use a third-party app? That's the where you're entering that information. That would be provided inside of an SOP. The how to put the information into the system is the work instructions. But all of those other questions, the when, the why, the where, the who should do it, you know, what role should do it, all of those questions are all being answered in the SOP. And so it's very important to make sure that you have an SOP, and that if you've had an SOP in the past, that you are reviewing those and adjusting them to include the right work instructions and to include changes where real world activity has to be expressed differently now because Metrc has differences to BioTrack.
Yeah. And what I think we've found a lot is those nuances between the different steps or stages that you would take in different operations can now be really efficiently laid out in those SOPs. Why are they slightly different at these different points that otherwise seem like the same process and product? And if you're training, onboarding that new individual with instructions that are really well laid out tends to be really helpful. I know we have another agenda item here, and we're probably going to have very little time to touch on it. And it's a big topic by itself. I do, though, think it's one of the things that we get asked a lot. You know, when we're over in BioTrack, we get to define our physical world processes however we work, and what we report to BioTrack. You know, everybody here is probably familiar with how you structure those in such a way that they meet that reporting requirement, but it gives you that kind of flexibility. I think in maybe one of our next sessions, we'll work on what does that look like in Metrc, because Metrc is going to have a very different way of structuring your processes. And there are tools that make the defining of your process and your stages just like you want, pretty flexible, while still integrating with Metrc in the way that it requires.
Yeah.
So I think we might end up touching on that. We're kind of at time here for today's topic, but we'll look at covering that in one of the next ones. Gabe or Rachel, did we have anything else we needed to touch on before we wrapped up?
I think that's a good landing spot.
Perfect. All right. Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Appreciate you.
Thanks so much, everyone.